We're almost halfway through the year, and a lot of people are running on empty without fully realizing it. Grow Therapy helps you find care that's covered by insurance before burnout becomes the baseline. Whether it's your first time in therapy or your 50th, Grow makes it easier to find a therapist who fits you, not the other way around. They connect you with thousands of independent licensed therapists across the U.S., offering both virtual and in-person sessions, nights and weekends. You can search by what matters, like insurance, specialty, identity, or availability, and get started in as little as 2 days. And if something comes up, you can cancel up to 24 hours in advance at no cost. There are no subscriptions, no long-term commitments. You just pay per session. Grow helps you find therapy on your time. Whatever challenges you're facing, Grow Therapy is here to help. Grow accepts over 100 insurance plans, including Medicaid in some states. Sessions average about $21 with insurance, and some pay as little as $0 depending on their plan. Visit growtherapy.com/booknow to get started. That's growtherapy.com/booknow. growtherapy.com/booknow. Availability and coverage vary by state and insurance plan.
With the new MyLowe's Pro Rewards American Express card, earn 3 points per dollar spent on Lowe's qualifying purchases for the first 6 months after card account opening. Plus, save 5% every day on eligible purchases at Lowe's and earn points on eligible purchases everywhere else Amex is accepted. Card members get more at Lowe's. Subject to credit approval. 5% can't be combined with any other offer. Exclusions and restrictions apply. Points subject to loyalty terms at Lowe's.com/terms and credit reward terms at Synchrony.com/MLPRA-terms. Visit Lowe's.com/business credit.
History as it happens, May 29th, 2026. The Nakba, 1947 to present.
The map shows what partition means. The Jewish state colored light, the Arab state dark, Jaffa to go to the Arabs, Jerusalem internationalized.
The resolution of the DAC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
During this time, fighting between Arabs and Jews was a commonplace occurrence, and there were many casualties on both sides through stabbing and shooting.
Arab opposition to the partition scheme has been violent. The call for a holy war against the Jews went out from Cairo.
Jaffa itself has become an almost deserted city, most of the 70,000 inhabitants having left when the State of Israel was proclaimed.
Months before David Ben-Gurion declared Israeli independence in 1948, creating a Jewish state in a mostly Arab land, the Nakba was underway. The Nakba, or catastrophe, is the other half of Israel's origin story that is often erased. But without it, it's impossible to understand today's catastrophe. What started in 1947 continues today, in the destruction of Gaza and annexation of the West Bank. That's next as we report history as it happens. I'm Martin DeCaro.
There is a large red and white mast over there in the distance, and that is the marker for the so-called yellow line.
In the Middle East, Israel has been levelling thousands of civilian buildings in Gaza in controlled explosions.
Homes, streets, parks, once bustling with life, now in ruins.
It's dynamic. The impulse was there in 48 with the Nakba, but it was there in 1909. This is the logic of the settler colonial movement that has achieved a victory through expulsion, through genocide.
In the long and violent Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there is a lot of finger-pointing. Like, who started it? Well, they did, and now our side is defending itself. You hear that now, and you might have heard it in 1948 when Israel's Arab neighbors attacked it.
With Arab invasion imminent, Haganah troops abandon underground activities to train for open war. First Arab attacks are fierce, and tribal troops make quick work of conquest in Old Jerusalem.
This is a history full of competing claims to the same sliver of land, of conflicting narratives. No single incident or event may be more important to these narratives that have taken shape over the past century than what happened from late 1947 through 1948, starting with the UN partition vote in November 47.
There was heated debate in the Assembly. This is the delegate from Saudi Arabia arguing against partition. Then Senor Arana of Brazil, presiding, calls on the nations to vote and announces how they vote.
Saudi Arabia? No. Soviet Union? Yes. United Kingdom? Abstain. The United States? Yes?
The resolution of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
And this was the scene next day in Jerusalem. The Jewish people had
As historian Ilan Pape writes in The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, the partition resolution was adopted on 29th of November 1947, and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine began in early December 1947, with a series of Jewish attacks on Palestinian villages and neighborhoods, in retaliation for the buses and shopping centers that had been vandalized in the Palestinian protest against the UN resolution during the first few days of its adoption. Though sporadic, he says, these early Jewish assaults were severe enough to cause the exodus of a substantial number of people, almost 75,000. And then on January 9th, 1948, he says, units of the First All-Arab Volunteer Army entered Palestine and engaged with the Jewish forces in small battles over routes and isolated Jewish settlements. Easily winning the upper hand in these skirmishes, the Jewish leadership officially shifted its tactics from acts of retaliation to cleansing operations.
Haifa and its harbor become the center of bitter conflict as the new Jewish state is born in the tense atmosphere of civil war. Haganah troops search for Arabs after capturing the city. Arab strongpoints are taken after being blasted to rubble. During the mopping up operations, Haganah forces seek out every Arab, and barricades are set up to screen those who had not already fled the
So, even before the moment of world historical importance, Israel's declaration of independence in mid-May 1948 and the war that immediately followed, Jewish forces started to expel Arabs and destroy their homes and villages by the hundreds, erasing their presence from their ancestral homeland. And we can hear echoes of this initial erasure today.
The Commission concluded that Israel has committed genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza and that it is continuing with that genocide.
Residences, homes, hospitals, universities, schools, museums, churches, mosques, archaeological sites, roads.
In March, at least 8 Palestinians were killed by settlers. 9 others were killed in Israeli army operations in the occupied West Bank.
Palestinians have the right to return to Gaza if they left while the rebuilding was happening.
It would be my hope that we could do something really nice, really good, where they wouldn't want to return. Why would they want to return? The place has been hell. It's been one of the meanest, toughest places on earth. And right now, I've seen every picture from every angle, better than if I were there. And nobody can live there. You can't live there.
The expulsion of some 750,000 Palestinian Arabs in 1947-48, about half the population, was a crime whose consequences remain unresolved, that fueled generations of violence and resentment on both sides of the conflict. Yet what is known about the Nakba, the Arab word for catastrophe, isn't nearly as well known or understood as the triumphant story of Israel's founding. I myself only recently learned some of these details, that David Ben-Gurion and his consultancy, as it was called, had been planning this ethnic cleansing, one of the first of the post-World War II era, an era that was supposed to see an end to such ethnic violence. So how did the story of the Nakba disappear for so long? Only relatively recently did historians and the broader public begin to understand what took place. Mark LeVine teaches the history of the modern Middle East at the University of California-Irvine and is the author of Overthrowing Geography, Jaffa, Tel Aviv, and the Struggle for Palestine. And most recently, Art Beyond the Edge, Creativity and Conflict in a World on Fire. Our conversation next. Tap subscribe now in the show notes for ad-free listening, early access, and all of our bonus content. Or go to historyasithappens.com. Mark LeVine, welcome to the show.
Really great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Joining us from Nigeria. So, how do you define ethnic cleansing? And was the Nakba, or catastrophe, the expulsion of Palestinians from the British Mandate of Palestine, was that an example of ethnic cleansing?
Well, I think ethnic cleansing can be defined as the removal of a population that has lived on a territory for a long period of time, that if not indigenous in the in the international legal sense has certainly been there for generations. It's forcible removal by a more powerful force, permanent removal so that it can't return. In that sense, obviously 1948, the Nakba was one of the singular events of ethnic cleansing in the world. It certainly wasn't the first. It may not have even been the largest in the sense of the number of people who were expelled. Certainly during partition of India, millions and millions of people were ethnically cleansed or exchanged. The creation of Greece. I mean, after World War I, there's many examples of ethnic cleansing. What makes the Nakba so singular and so important is that it was at the start of a process, well, first of all, it wasn't even the start. It was the conclusion of a process of ethnic cleansing that actually goes back at least to 1909 in Palestine and continued long after 1948 to the present moment. What made it so important for me as a historian of Palestine and Israel and Zionism is that it really, at this point, is in the middle. It's a fulcrum point of a much longer durée process.
You know, history often doesn't operate along a straight line, but when you're considering the origins of today's conflict, today's catastrophe, you can draw a pretty straight line back to 1948 or even before that, right? I mean, this is the key moment that sets the stage for everything that happens after that. Doesn't mean that all the events since 48 were inevitable. There are opportunities to take a different turn off this road, like the Oslo peace process, for instance.
Even to define 1948, well, I just said it was a fulcrum.
Sure.
And certainly historically, in terms of periodization, it certainly acts like a fulcrum. But I do think the act that started it is the moment that Zionism in reality, not just as an ideology, going back, we know the date really to 1909, when the still fledgling Zionist movement and leadership in Palestine, as opposed to the earliest Zionist leadership who were largely outside of Palestine. Once you get the Zionist leadership in Palestine trying to colonize this country, realizing that the growing number of Jewish immigrants simply could not sustain themselves. They could not create an economy, a viable Jewish economy, and they certainly could not compete in the larger economy with the indigenous Palestinian Arab population because they'd been there for centuries, generations and centuries, most of them, and therefore any kind of work that was autochthonous to Palestine was something they knew how to do, and the Jewish immigrants simply would take years, if not generations, to acquire the same level of skills and familiarity. So at that moment in 1909, they've been trying for several years to what they termed conquer the labor market, to create enough jobs for Jews to make a viable society. And they realized it just wasn't going to happen. And that's when they decided that the only way to conquer the labor market was to conquer territory, was to create spaces that were exclusively Jewish, in which there was no competition from Palestinian Arabs, and therefore they could create a Jewish economy without this competition from the indigenous population. That starts in 1909. That is when, as the Israeli sociologist and historian Gershon Shafir said, Zionism becomes a militant nationalist enterprise. While it wasn't inevitable that 1948 would happen, that you'd get this massive ethnic cleansing, because if World War I didn't happen and the Ottoman Empire remained in control, who knows what would have happened. But certainly, as history unfolds, that initiatory moment of an ideology that now on the ground was all about conquering territory and removing the indigenous population from it, once the opportunity arose, it was always going to produce what happened.
To your point, even with a lot of Zionist land purchases, Jews only owned 6% of the land in the British Mandate of Palestine by 1948.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and of course, inevitability. I mean, the British leaving the mandate, giving up the mandate after the Second World War created an opportunity that maybe wasn't foreseen 30 years earlier. It's really important to emphasize this. Population transfers, ethnic cleansing. I mean, that is often the norm through history. The United States was founded in part on...
The greatest exemplar.
But the thing about this is, this example, the Nakba was largely forgotten or erased. It's the other half of the story, as Ilan Pappé said in his great book published 20 years ago. Why was that? Why is this incident or event not well known?
not well known to whom. The idea that Israelis don't know what happened in 1948. I don't know. I lived there long enough.
Yes.
There's this idea, we didn't know, we don't know. I think it's kind of an excuse. I think every Israeli knows. It's like asking white people in America in the South in the 50s, is there racism? Oh, no, there's no. Of course, they were going to say there's no racism. Oh, we treated Black people well. Slaves were well treated. Everyone knows that's a lie. And in the same way, I do not believe that most Israelis never knew, specifically because there were the ruins of the villages everywhere, specifically because the neighborhoods were still there in the towns that were taken over, specifically because there were Jews who came in and literally moved into homes that still had the dinner plates on the table. I mean, there was a willful refusal to discuss. And then, of course, new generations in history books. But it's not like no one spoke about this. So I think within Israel, it was certainly known and has always been known, which is the reason why it was so important to keep Palestinians from speaking, to keep them silenced, because everyone did know and knew that if that could be talked about openly, very similar, let's say, to the Armenian genocide, which is why in Turkey it was still criminalized. It's not like Turks don't know about the Armenian genocide. Everyone knows about it. You can't talk about it precisely because everyone knows about it and they know what it means. In terms of the world, well, obviously in the Arab world, everyone knew about it. In America is the interesting place where there was this kind of forced forgetting. If you look at the news at the time in the late 40s in newspapers, they were reporting what was happening.
Yeah, newsreel showed it.
It was a forced forgetting later.
Yeah. In the back streets of Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Jaffa, the thugs of both sides build up the armored cars for war against each other. In between them, victims of the struggle, stand the great majorities of simple people of both sides.
So what makes it more interesting is the fact that it was a forced forgetting. It wasn't like it was never known. It was known, and people understood that it couldn't be known. And even though it was still known to so many, it couldn't be talked about. I think the reason for that is that it was a very particular type of settler colonialism. You have lots of genocides, you have lots of ethnic cleansings in the history of colonialism and imperialism. They come under multiple forms. One would be the ethnic cleansing of typical imperialism or administrative colonialism, when you have the takeover of a foreign territory and you clear out indigenous populations so you could take over their land and then create plantations or farms or mining or whatever you want to use that territory for, that you need to remove the population. Then you have the settler colonialism of the Algerian type, where it's a settler colony, but it has its own metropole back home. And it was not really a replacement colony. Even South Africa, as horrific as the colonization was not a replacement colony. In Palestine, it was a replacement colony by a people that had no home just to go back to. And so that made the ethnic cleansing that much more intense. There's a quote from Begin when they were about to conquer Jaffa, the paramilitary forces under his control. And it's now prominently displayed in the Beit Irgun, or the Museum of the Irgun, or Lehi, right on the beach near Jaffa in the neighborhood of Manshia. And it says, "We are about to start this battle," I'm paraphrasing, "show no mercy to them as they showed no mercy to you." So this was an understanding what was going on. It was never really forgotten because you just needed to go into that museum. No one was hiding it, right? But the fact that Zionism in Palestine was a replacement settler colony, similar to the US, which is why now you see even today, Donald Trump and the Republicans trying to get rid of this history, saying we can't teach this history, erasing it from national parks and museums and so on, because it legitimates the very founding myth without which the legitimacy of the entire enterprise is in question.
Is a country illegitimate if it's founded on settler colonialism, replacement settler colonies? That's a very difficult question to answer. But yeah, I think you're right. It wasn't that it was forgotten so much as it was erased. Ilan Pappé, in his book that I mentioned, talks about how it was half the story that was left out from the common retelling or the common memory, because origin stories are so important to any nation. And of course they want to leave out the ugly parts, especially the timing here, right? We're in the post-1945 era where this type of thing's not supposed to happen anymore. And it's being done by people, the Zionists, who are seeking a refuge from having something like this happen to them in Europe.
Yeah.
So
it's being done by the victims of the very thing that's supposed to make this impossible to do again right at the moment. I mean, it's very telling and not at all coincidental that the Nakba happens the same year as the Genocide Convention by the UN. So they go together. And the forgetting and the violence of the Nakba is not an antecedent to the convention. It's not outside of the convention. It's very much the twin of the convention and helps us understand why there keeps on being genocides. And they seem so hard to stop because the Genocide Convention can't deal with ethnic cleansing. It can't deal with political genocides. It can't deal with cultural genocides. It itself was a fatally flawed document. For all the good it has done to raise awareness about it, legally it is a very highly problematic document, as Lemkin, the author of the concept himself, knew and tried to make more robust. But the countries, the states, had no intention of enabling that kind of full and robust idea of genocide to become international law, even though most of his examples of genocides were settler colonial genocides, the Herero and other genocides in the Americas. He talked a lot about Native Americans and their extermination. So he knew, everyone understood, but states don't want to be circumscribed in their power that way.
Sure, and before anyone flips out, I just want to clarify. I was not saying that what happened to the Jews in Europe is the same as what happened to the Arabs of Palestine. The broad point of forcing people out of a country that you don't want to coexist with. One of Pape's many excellent observations, and this is something that I only learned about fairly recently in my life. I never knew what the Nakba was until I think I got to college. You know, the whole story about plucky Israel, the underdog in the Middle East, nearly snuffed out
Paul Newman.
At its birth in 1948 by the evil Arab countries that wanted to destroy it, right? A couple of things that Pape points out that kind of poke holes in that narrative is, number one, Zionism ideologically called for population transfers. It was incompatible fundamentally with peaceful coexistence with a Palestinian presence. And number two, the ethnic cleansing, the expulsion of the Arabs that began in 1947 was planned. It wasn't just an accident or an opportunity taken. It was planned ahead of time.
Absolutely. And this is, of course, where there's a big fault line within Israeli scholarship. You know, the people who first talked about it, even really before Pape, people like Benny Morris, who, wrote The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, did an amazing job of looking at all these newly opened files of 40 years after the creation of the state in 1988, when they were released because Israel had a 40-year declassification program. So all of a sudden, Israeli scholars had access to documents about 1948. But what Benny Morris did, and what a lot of the new historians did, that generation, not Pape, but ones who remain within the Zionist fold, was they showed that, yes, there was this expulsion that happened. You can't deny it, but it was haphazard. It wasn't planned. It was a consequence of war. And by the way, if the Arabs had just recognized Israel in the lesser boundaries, the smaller boundaries it had, with the 1947 partition plan, this wouldn't have happened anyway, right? So you're absolutely right. And then you have the scholars like Pape who went much further, and of course Palestinian scholars, Noor Masalha and so many others, who said you're just reading the documentation wrong, and it's very clear that there was an intention. But again, you can't even ask this question if you go back to the early 20th century, forgetting about Herzl infamously saying that the poor Arabs will be spirited across the border. We all know this quote, anyone who's ever looked at the conflict. It's much more about the mechanics of settlement. My first book was on the history of Jaffa and Tel Aviv, when the society, the sort of real estate group, a group of 60 Jews from Jaffa, some of whom were North African, some of whom were European, bought this territory north of Jaffa, right near the neighborhood of Manshia, to create this new garden suburb that would be called Tel Aviv. Their bylaws said it had to be exclusively Jewish. The land that was purchased was an orchard. It was a marginal orchard, but it was an orchard. Anyone who's ever been in Israel-Palestine knows that the sands are incredibly fertile. You can be in a sand dune, and then there'll be orange trees growing right out of it because of the nature of the soil and the sand in Palestine. So this idea that it was a city, as the founders of Tel Aviv said, born out of the sands, right, is simply not true. But it had to be imagined that way. The erasure that you're talking about actually begins discursively, imaginatively, ideologically, half a century almost before 1948. And then as they gain more and more territory in almost every place they created, starting in 1909 when the first city and the first kibbutz, or agricultural settlement, Tel Aviv and Degania, were created. What distinguished them from previous Jewish settlements was that they were by law, or by their bylaws, exclusively Jewish. No Arabs could live there, right? And as territory was purchased, usually from absentee owners or village heads, they began to push and push out more and more Palestinians. That led to the violence of 1921, of 1929, 1936, right? So 48 couldn't happen without this history. That's why, to me, while it's a fulcrum, it's still the real thing is at the beginning.
You know, as I was listening to your answer there, I started to think of Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and any number of others, Israeli political figures and media commentators today who talk of driving all the remaining Palestinians out of our midst. You mentioned Benny Morris. I have an article open here from the Journal of Genocide Research, which Dirk Moses, our friend, edits. It's an essay by Martin Shaw.
I'm on the board, actually.
Oh, great.
Of it.
So I'm sure you've read this essay that Martin Shaw wrote about how what's happening to the Palestinians is a slow-motion genocide that's been happening for 80 years. Yeah. In that essay, he has a footnote citing Benny Morris and the book you mentioned, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem. For Zionists, the logic of a transfer solution to the Arab problem remained ineluctable without some sort of massive displacement of Arabs from the area of the Jewish state to be. There could be no viable Jewish state. And, and that's the weird thing about this erasure. You can just go back and find, without much difficulty, any number of major Zionist figures. I have Ilan Pappé's book here. He quotes them chapter and verse, talking about wanting to do this, that we have to do it to have a Jewish state. We must get rid of as many Arabs as possible.
Again, if you have a state defined by ethno-nationalism, right, ethno-religious nationalism, there's only two ways to have that state in a specific territory. One, there is no competing population to worry about. And if they're there, you got to get rid of them. Or two, the South African model, you rule over them in a kind of apartheid colonial system where they're herded into Bantustans, have very few rights, which is the kind of way that Israelis, especially on the right, imagine whatever Palestinians remain in the West Bank or Gaza would exist, and a kind of Bantustan as a kind of tertiary labor force doing all the menial work. And that's certainly how it was after 1967, for example, or for the Palestinians within the borders in 1948 Israel after the war. We need to remember something. This is something to me that always strikes me as funny. You have so many Israel supporters and Israelis who say, we are indigenous. We're the indigenous population. Palestinians, early Zionists used to call them renters. They said they are the renters on the land. We are the original owners. And we've come home. And just like your own house, if you're going to come home, the renters got to go. That's sorry, but we're home. Find somewhere else to live. But what's almost funny to me is that that's the literal opposite of the biblical narrative. The biblical narrative starts off in southern Iraq, in Mesopotamia. God literally tells to Abram, he hasn't even had a covenant yet, right? He hasn't even changed his name. Leave this land and go to a land I will show you, and I will make of your descendants, innumerable, and this will be a land of milk and honey and all that. And then literally Hebrew means to cross over. I mean, the whole narrative is that this isn't their land. And it belongs to someone else. And God doesn't like these pissed off at the people who live there because he doesn't like how they worship. And he's going to kick them out. I'm going to give you the land now. So how are you indigenous if literally your origin story is that you came in and conquered land, blew down the walls of Jericho with a trumpet and so on and so forth? Never mind, that never happened. But in reality, we know from archaeological evidence. But the narrative is so clear, right? This whole conquest narrative of we were not from there. God gave this to us in a covenant, multiple covenants, and then we came in and conquered it. So it already says you're not indigenous. So when they use this idea of we were always here, I just have to laugh. It's like, don't you even read your own Bible, your own religious text? That's insane to make this claim.
I had forgotten all about that. As an atheist, I don't pick up a Bible too often anymore, but there's no excuse. I think even atheists need to be familiar with what's in that book.
It's an amazing work of literature, that's for sure.
As one of my old friends used to say, it's the greatest work of fiction ever written. He was also an atheist. But yeah, I mean, these are part of what you just said is part of an origin story. So why don't we get into some chronology here? We're not going to start in biblical times. We'll go to the early 20th century when Zionist immigration starts to pick up. When did the Arab population begin to notice or complain about the possibility that Zionist immigrants weren't just coming there to assimilate, they were coming there to colonize and even displace them?
You could make a case. Rashid Khalidi also makes this case a bit, and I certainly did in my first book, Overthrowing Geography, that already in the late 19th century, you had local Palestinians, or if you could call them Palestinians. Palestinian nationalism hadn't really emerged yet fully, but certainly in the 1870s or so, there were colonies that were being established. The German colony, for example, an American colony, but they were very small. They were for religious reasons. They were coming to live there, but how are they going to get the land? They're going to buy the land. Sometimes they would displace the Arabs who were on that land, or they would come into conflict with them. So people were thinking, and this was very different than the Jews who lived there, who were Ottoman Jews, North African or Arab or Levantine Jews who spoke Arabic, who were completely integrated, who lived there for a long time. These people, not all of whom were Jews, who were from other places in Europe or the US, they're like, what's going on with these people, right? But it wasn't at the level where someone could see there's a grander design. Then you have really the movement of Zionists, in larger numbers, beginning with the second Aliyah, or wave of immigration, 1906 or so. And you start seeing significant numbers of Jews who had no previous attachment to the land, who didn't have the training or the religious commitment, who were suddenly showing up here and needed lots of land and services and money and jobs. And that's when you start seeing Palestinians. And at this point, by the first decade of the 20th century, you can start talking about Palestinians, because there was a particular imagination of the Arab-speaking non-Jewish population of Palestine, that this territory was somehow unique from other parts of the larger region, from the area around Damascus. There were still people who thought there'd be a greater Syria, even in Palestine. But in Palestine, people were starting to talk about Palestine. The newspaper Palestine is founded in 1911, for example. So we know by 1911 they're thinking this. So I would say by the first decade, again, right when Zionism becomes really organized, right when the colonization process begins in earnest, right when these technologies of conquest, labor market and land begin to take off, you could see it even in the newspapers. I'll just give you one example very quickly. When Tel Aviv was born, the local ruler of Jaffa created a waqf, a religious endowment that could never be sold, 1.5 kilometers north of the old city of Jaffa, right? In an area that, why would he do that? He did that to block the further expansion of Tel Aviv and its ability to control more territory between where it was founded and the old town of Jaffa. So it's clear that people at different levels, from peasants to urban dwellers to local leaders, understood that Zionism was trying to take territory and claim it for exclusive Jewish settlement and ownership. So I think it goes back to there. Once the British take over, you start to see it pick up. 1921, you have the first Thawda, or revolt. And 1929, the major riots, whatever you want to call them, explosion, protests, violence. The reports that the British government did afterwards said that it was because of the increasing landlessness of the Palestinian population that led to this violence. So already by the 20s, it's a national conflict.
Well, your comment is really interesting, because the problem begins even before the Balfour Declaration. You say Palestinians started to see already that this was going to be a problem for them. Then, of course, with the Balfour Declaration during the First World War, now it's official. There's going to be a Jewish homeland, and I think there was an understanding that that meant a state. There are dreams, there are...
Maybe. I mean, I don't know that.
Well, the British changed their
minds. There
minds.
was a question of whether, a Jewish homeland in Palestine meant a state or some kind of autonomy.
Sure.
Certainly the Zionists hoped for a state.
The present Arab attack on the Jews is another and unhappily periodic attempt to undermine the right of the Jews to resettle in Palestine.
The main case of the Arabs is against the British government's policy in Palestine.
We are persuaded that the ruinous reign of murder, ambush, arson, and poisonous incitement must be dealt with more vigorously by the British government.
The members of the Commission to investigate the situation in Palestine. Lord Peel is the chairman.
I am well aware that we have to deal with difficult and delicate problems.
And as I mentioned, the British did change their minds a little bit too late.
Right.
So after 1945, World War II ends, and the Jewish groups, the Jewish militias, they understand that if they're going to achieve their goals, they got to get the British out. And there's the bombing of the King David Hotel, 1946. That was a terrorist attack by the Irgun.
And the result of the crime, the tragic scene, is like a serious incident during the Blitz. The hotel housed the British Army headquarters and the Palestine government offices, and casualties were very heavy. 65 deaths are reported, and there is little or no hope of survival for any of the 58 missing. Nearly 50 others were injured. The Jewish terrorist organization, Irgun Zwei Leumi, openly admitted responsibility for the bombing.
Menachem Begin, remember that guy? He becomes a prime minister a couple decades later, right?
So does Shamir, Yitzhak Shamir,
That's right.
even more radical group.
So I was saying there are dreams and there are intentions, and then eventually there could be something called a plan or even a blueprint. David Ben-Gurion becomes the unquestioned leader of the Zionist movement. He wants the British out. The British announce in early 1947 they're going to quit the mandate. They're doing a terrible job of maintaining order. They refer it to the United Nations. The United Nations votes in November 1947 to partition Palestine between the two peoples. When did Ben-Gurion and what was called his consultancy, when did they sit down and start beginning to plan the expulsion of the Arab population?
That's a really good question.
You don't have to give me the exact day and hour on the clock, but it was around this time.
I don't think anyone could. I think in 46 and early 47, there is enough intercommunal violence happening. Palestinians are attacking Jews in different places. The Haganah, and let's remember the Haganah worked very closely with the British after the Great Revolt. So while the Zionist movement wanted to get rid of the British, when it knew it could win the war, right? I mean, it didn't want the British out so quickly because it wasn't in a position right away after the war at all to achieve independence and hold territory. So I think there was a calculation among the Zionist leadership, and especially those who really understood the situation and those who had military training, that the British were leaving and they needed to prepare for war, because they were not willing to live in a bifurcated Palestine. They were not willing to live with a large Arab minority or Palestinian minority in whatever territory was assigned to them, because they knew even if it was, 2/3 to 1/3, they could do the math. In 20, 30 years, there would be parity and then it couldn't be a Jewish state anymore. So there was an understanding that there was going to be violence and that they had to plan for when that moment came, removing as many people as possible. By mid-46 through mid-47 is when you get that, so that by the time the Civil War part breaks out in November, you really see the movements of troops, the purchasing of arms, and so on to prepare for that.
Yeah, November 47, the partition vote. The expulsions of the Arab population begin in December. So there was something called the Long Seminar, right? The Long Seminar. This was Ben-Gurion and his co-leaders of the Zionist movement. The antecedent to Plan Dalet, Plan D. What was the Long Seminar? Could that be considered a plan for expulsion?
Yes, a plan for expulsion. It was definitely a way to cement a reality that if this comes to violence, which it was going to, they had to remove as many Palestinians as possible from whatever territory they could conquer. And I think that becomes the basis of what in Hebrew is Tochni Dalet, which becomes Plan Dalet, which begins in the spring, of course, so several months later. On the one hand, it can be a practical response, you could say, to a situation where a civil war was starting and the Zionist leadership knew it had to plan for even more fighting once the mandate officially ended. But for others, it was also the opportunity, right? And I think they knew also by the beginning of 48, they were in a strategic situation where they could actually win this thing. And the one thing we know is that by the time the actual war started in May, by the time independence was declared, they had had secret agreements, of course, especially with the Transjordanians, right? Golda Meir did these famous secret meetings, which basically said that with the exception of Jerusalem, they would not fight over the large body of territory that constituted the West Bank, and therefore Jordan would be able to claim the West Bank and conquer it, and they wouldn't go further, more or less, than what the geography of the West Bank ultimately became. I think they understood that the Egyptians and the Syrians and Lebanese and Iraqis did not constitute a force that was capable of actually defeating this rapidly growing Zionist and then Israeli military. We could look at a map and say, oh my God, it was a miracle or a curse, whichever side you're on. This tiny little country defeats these surrounding countries that had 10 times or more the population. In reality, the number of men under arms was greater within the Zionist movement and then Israel than the total number of surrounding Arabs and Palestinians, and their weapons were ultimately superior. So the outcome was not really in doubt.
The conversation continues, but you never have to listen to ads again, and you can support the show. Tap subscribe now in the show notes or go to historyasithappens.com. And the initial Arab force prior to May 48 that went in there was to stop expulsions, right?
Right. Well, everyone had their own reasons. I think if there's a common thread to why the Arab armies were intervening, there were two things. First, yes, to prevent a large number of refugees from going into their territory, which would destabilize them, but also because they did not want a Palestinian state created. I mean, one of the ironies of this is that the Arab leaders, including Abdallah and Jordan, they did not want a Palestinian state on the third most holy territory in Islam to exist, because that would have been a state that had more symbolic power than any of them. And it would also be a state that would be very strategically placed to challenge their supremacy. So Palestinians were really fighting against everyone in that sense. They're fighting directly against the Zionist forces, but also against other forces that didn't have their interest at heart.
Because, until recently, it was never entirely clear to me why the Arabs boycotted the partition or voted against partition. But there were a lot of reasons.
Well, there's a lot. First of all, most indigenous populations, as Jabotinsky and others, even Ben Gurion said, why would they? I mean, who votes to give away more than half their country to a foreign occupation, whether or not the foreigners claim the right to be there? Of course, no one was going to do it. Second of all, the way the partition was structured, besides the fact that Jews were a small percentage of the population, relatively speaking, with only 6% of the territory, they were given more or less half or more, and it was the best land, the plains and the most fertile land and everything.
At Flushing, Long Island, the General Assembly of the United Nations has made its decision on Palestine. The map shows what partition means. The Jewish state colored light, the Arab state dark, Jaffa to go to the Arabs, Jerusalem internationalized.
And of course, let's remember the entire Palestinian leadership had been decimated after 36, right? They were sent into exile, they were jailed, they were killed. And then the Palestinian leadership that was still around, Husseini, obviously made the choice to, once he was exiled, to work with Hitler, which of course, once Hitler lost, that was definitely a bad bet. He was in no position to lead the movement in any meaningful sense. So that's the problem for them. They had no one that would actually be supporting them, that they could trust.
Yeah, I just recently did an episode on the first Palestinian uprising, so to speak, 1936 to 1939. Because anyone listening to this might be wondering, well, okay, there was a civil war that broke out in 47 after partition. There had already been violence. Then you get the war for Israel's independence starting in mid-May 1948. You have all these expulsions where people might be asking, well, why weren't the Arabs fighting back? Why couldn't they defend themselves? Well, they did have military forces or militias, but their leadership had been utterly destroyed by the crackdown, the British crackdown on their revolt a decade earlier.
Yeah, and then World War II happened, and World War II gave the British the excuse to crack down even harder and securitize population even more. And then in the wake of World War II, when it's clear what happened to Jews, and it became even harder, even though they tried to prevent Jews from coming officially. So they just never had the chance. But again, this goes back. We can't talk about these last 4 years, 3-4 years. We need to go back to the origin of the mandate, to the Balfour Declaration, which becomes enshrined, which says that Her Majesty's government looks favorably to the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine as long as it recognizes the civil and religious rights of the local population, right? Paraphrase, I don't think that's the exact words, but it's pretty close. It's civil and religious rights for Palestinians or Arabs or non-Jews, not even a positive designation, just non-Jews. And then the Jews get the political rights. So because of that, the Jewish Agency was able to create an entire para-state structure beginning in the 1920s. Because it was bringing in so much money from the global Jewish community, it was looked on very favorably by the British because, the British taxpayers did not want to be paying for Palestine. So for so many reasons, the Jews in Palestine were the natural allies of the British. They were European. They paid more than paid their way. They were institutionally promised Palestine. And the local Palestinians, who were Arabs, who were colonized already by the British in other places, and the Palestinian executive, the Arab executive, never had the rights, never had the political power legally enshrined that their Jewish counterparts did. So they were already hands tied behind their back at the beginning of the mandate. And then with the land purchases, especially throughout the 1920s and through 1936, they were losing more and more territory and more power. And once the revolt occurred and was then crushed, and then World War II happens, there was no way to recover and equalize the terrain, so to speak, even though numerically they were obviously far superior. And in terms of territory, they theoretically controlled more. But in fact, they didn't, because the British controlled the territory.
So in all, about 750,000 to 800,000 Palestinians either fled or were expelled. The key point is they were not allowed back. And that'll be the final thing we discuss here.
Right, which is the key.
Yes. I just want to offer up some more of Alain Pape. So 800,000 people, hundreds of villages wiped off the face of the earth. Urban centers cleansed.
500, more or less.
Cleansed of Palestinians. Here's Pape, January 9th, 1948. So the expulsions are already underway. He says units of the first all-Arab volunteer army entered Palestine and took on Jewish forces in small battles over routes and isolated Jewish settlements. The Jewish forces won these engagements easily, and then, according to Pape, coerced expulsions followed in the middle of February 1948. Jewish troops succeeded in emptying 5 Palestinian villages in a single day, March 10th, 1948. So we're still 2 months away from independence. Plan Dalet is adopted. The first targets, urban centers of Palestine, which had all been occupied by the end of April. 250,000 Palestinians were uprooted in this phase alone.
Already.
And it was accompanied by several massacres. So before we wrap up, I have another question before we get to the most important thing of all, that the people weren't allowed back. What did this all physically entail? Showing up at people's doors with weapons and saying, get the hell out of here, just bulldozing people's homes down, bombing them, massacres? I mean, what was happening?
Keep going.
Okay.
All of the above and more as occurs. I mean, this is not unique, by the way, right? It really depends on the area. The most interesting thing and terrible thing, perhaps, is there were many villages where the villagers had made agreements with local Zionists and then Israeli forces to be spared. But because Ben-Gurion and the leadership understood that they couldn't remain, or they believed they shouldn't remain, they were forced out anyway. And there was a lot of villages where they were just shocked because they thought if they stayed put, that's what they were told by the Zionists and then the Israelis after May 14th. If you stay, if you don't fight us, you can stay. And they couldn't stay, many of them, the vast majority of them, because again, the goal was not to not fight with the Palestinians. The goal was to expel the Palestinians because you couldn't have long-term a viable Jewish state with a significant Palestinian minority. It's just very simple because they would not agree long-term to a Jewish state that ruled over them in a non-democratic manner. Benny Morris and others are right. It was inevitable. We may not agree with the morality of it, but it's certainly true. They were never going to allow this to happen, so they found every excuse. And the closer you get to May 14th, and then after the full war starts, now between states and Palestinian Arab irregulars, quote unquote, you get more and more extreme violence against civilians because that's the most effective way to clear territory. One Deir Yassin could clear out 20 villages. Do you want to be the next Deir Yassin? And we know that was done, and they would leave. Or you take out and you shoot a certain number of people and the rest leave. Look at Israelis. A couple of rockets from Hezbollah and they're running down to the south today. I don't blame them, by the way. I've been there during rocket fire. I'm certainly not going to stick around. That's what people do when they think they're going to die. They leave unless they're fighting, unless they're part of a military force. So of course they left. Also because they had somewhere to go. And this is a big thing also people don't realize. Most of the Israelis, this is not today where you could say go back to Brooklyn, to half the settlers, right, or wherever they're from. So many are from the US. These people were refugees, many of them, or they came from Russia or wherever decades ago, or their parents did. This was it.
Yeah.
They couldn't get on a boat in Jaffa and go to Beirut or go to Gaza.
They had come from displaced persons camps after the end of the Second World War. They weren't wanted in Europe, the few who survived the Holocaust. So, and as you mentioned before, how the British tried to restrict immigration, many Jews after World War II had to, quote unquote, illegally immigrate to Palestine.
As Germany and other nations increase their persecution, treat them as pariahs and outcasts, beat them down and trample on them, the Jews are turning more and more to their promised land. The land which they were told once would be flowing with milk and honey. On the quayside of the Jewish port of Tel Aviv, more and more families are being reunited. More and more children who have come to prepare the way are welcoming mothers and fathers, turning with them towards the new life in the only land in the world where there seems a hope of living in peace.
Most people had in living memory World War I. The Ottomans and even the British forced people out of their homes. But they did that, said, this is a war zone, you have to leave. Once the war was over, they were allowed back. So it was within living memory that whoever wins, they could come back, right? So, and most people were not active fighters. They were not part of irregulars because they never had the chance to do what the Haganah did and what the Jewish forces did. So they assumed even if the Jews won, they would just go back. They'd have to figure it out under Jewish law. But guess what? No, they weren't coming back.
Yeah, that'll be our final point here. I just want to mention one other thing here, just to complete this. We were discussing before about intentionality, and when does something become an intention or a dream and then become a plan? When we were discussing when Ben-Gurion and his consultancy started formulating plans to expel the Arabs. Pape says before 47, there were other more urgent agendas they had to worry about, the primary mission being to build a political, economic, and cultural Zionist enclave within the country, etc., etc. Prior to 1948, March of 1948, the activities the Zionist leadership carried out to implement their vision could still be portrayed as retaliation for hostile Palestinian or Arab actions. However, after March 48, this was no longer the case. The Zionist leadership openly declared 2 months before the end of the British Mandate it would seek to take over the land and expel the indigenous population by force. Plan Dalit. Something else I didn't know until fairly recently, that shortly after the establishment of the State of Israel, Ben-Gurion floated a plan to bring back some of the Palestinians as a way of trying to solve what everyone could see would be a problem forever. You have a population that's just been driven out of their homes. They're right over the other side, right? There was no militarized border or fence separating Gaza from Israel proper. People could see in their refugee camps where they had lived, right on the other side. And Ben-Gurion,
yeah, very close by. Absolutely.
Yeah, Ben-Gurion wanted to bring back some Palestinians as a way of trying to solve this problem. The plan did not go anywhere. I don't want to oversimplify things, Mark, but here we are some 80 years later. We still have Palestinian refugees. Palestinian statelessness is still the fundamental issue here.
Ben-Gurion made an offer. I forget the exact number. It was a significant number, but it was still a 1/7, 1/8 of the total number. So of course it wasn't going to be accepted. But people understood that after a war, they were supposed to be allowed back to their homes, no matter who controlled the territory. This idea that you couldn't be allowed back, well, first of all, it was being enshrined now in the Geneva Convention, but it had already emerged as part of customary international law out of the Hague regulations, which were more about armed conflicts between states and militaries and armies. But between 1907 and 1947, especially with the horrors of World War I and II, it was increasingly clear that civilians have to be allowed back. Otherwise, you have longstanding problems that lead to more war. And there was the historical practice in Palestine that civilians would have to leave during the fighting and then be allowed back. But with Israel, there was never going to be the chance for them to return. That's why, to me, the questions of when was it that Israel decided to not let them in, was it intentional or not, that's interesting as a historian. It really doesn't matter. What matters is that by 1949, when you have both the UN resolutions and the Geneva Conventions, it doesn't matter who's controlling the country. Civilians are allowed home. So therefore, Israel was in violation of international law as of 1949, and they had every right to return. You could also say it was never going to be honored, because if Israel let in 400,000 Palestinians, let's say, Israel would not have been able to survive as a Jewish state. That's the point of this whole exercise, though, that the concept of a Jewish state can only be achieved through war and mass expulsion continuously, which is why you have the leadership today of Israel expelling people, trying to get rid of 1 million people from Gaza, going into Lebanon and expelling Lebanese, going into Syria. We hardly talk about it, but entire villages have been destroyed along the buffer zones by the Golan also. This is the logic of settler colonialism, which you mentioned Martin Shaw. Settler colonialism inevitably ends with genocide. It doesn't even end with genocide. Genocide is one of the tools. It's the natural tool. It's like taking out a wrench or a screwdriver to unscrew something. That's the tool you use. What we're looking at now, as horrific as it is, to anyone who's a historian and familiar with international law, it's not at all surprising that what we're seeing now is happening. It's not surprising to anyone I know that the moment Hamas engaged in this atrocity attack on October 7th, that was the trigger Israel had been waiting for. Because anyone who lived through Al-Aqsa, the Al-Aqsa Intifada, anyone who lived through the suicide bombings, anyone who lived through any act of Palestinian mass resistance, whether you want to justify it or not, whether you think it's legal or not, the reality is it was always met by Israel seizing more land and creating more settlements. So now this major attack, was going to give them the chance to clear out 1 million people, to kill. They don't even care anymore whether they kill or clear them out, but to permanently alter the population balance in such a way that annexation becomes possible. And that's really what we've seen in the last few years since October 7th. This dynamic, the impulse was there in 48 with the Nakba, but it was there in 1909, and it's there in 1929, it's there in 2026, right? This is the logic of a settler colonial movement that has achieved a victory through expulsion, through genocide, and continues to expand, because the whole ideology of settler colonial nationalism has to be expansion. It's the oxygen. Without it, it loses its justification. So it's horrible, it's shocking, it's unethical for me, it's a betrayal of Judaism, but it certainly makes sense where we are right now.
More than 40,000 Palestinians have now been killed in Gaza, a majority of whom are civilians. And these numbers are from the Palestinian Ministry of Health, but they are backed up by the United States, by international organizations. Humanitarian conditions in Gaza have degraded so much that diseases like polio and hepatitis A are now spreading. We have seen countless children be orphaned. We have seen countless mothers lose their children. How much is too much, sir? At what point is it time to to end this war?
Well, we'll end the war when we achieve our war goals of making sure that Hamas can't repeat such atrocities. But we're fighting this war in a just war with just means, in fact, with means that no other army has ever fought. No other army has taken the precautions that Israel has taken, sometimes at great risk, to make sure that we minimize the number of casualties. Because we think that every civilian death is a tragedy. For Hamas, every civilian death is a strategy. For us, it's a tragedy. There are 1.4 million people in Gaza. They moved from the north to the south. Now report honestly. Because here's what happened. They all left. They went to the humanitarian zone, which is 2 miles away, less, on the beach. They have tents. We supplied tents for 150,000 people. The aid agencies supplied the rest, and some of them carried their own tents. They have a place. We supplied water lines, sewage lines, food. There's more to be done, medical. So now we know how many people were killed, how many terrorists, because we counted them. And we just passed 2,000. Terrorists, body counts of terrorists. The people left. How many civilians died? I asked the commander of the division that did the Rafah operation and the Philadelphia corridor. He said, Prime Minister, there are hardly any civilian deaths because everybody left.
Make sure to sign up for my free newsletter. Just go to Substack and search for History as It Happens. In my next missive, I'll include links to all the recent episodes I've done on this subject, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And on the next episode of History as It Happens, we're heading back to the American Revolution. Kind of. It'll be the next installment in my America 250 series, The Enduring Meanings, plural, of the Declaration of Independence. What did Abraham Lincoln think of it? That's next as we report History as It Happens.